Hello and welcome to Oxford University Linguistics Society's final event for Hilary term 2021, or at least final interview. We're here with Dr. Jennifer Culbertson, who is reader and director at the Centre for Language Evolution at the School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. She does a lot of work in experimental syntax and seeing how language is shaped by learning and use. And that's what we're here to talk to her about today. We're very honored to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to talking about this stuff.
So we'll start with learning and use and experimentation. That syntax is the sort of central thing in linguistics, at least according to a huge number of people, and learning it is the key milestone in learning a language. So what sort of experiments have you conducted, and what have they shown us about how kids learn the languages they do?
Right. Yeah, I mean, so my experiments in general are interested in understanding how both child and adult learning kind of shape language. But you're kind of asking the reverse question. So what can we learn sort of about how kids learn language from these experiments? Yeah, so yeah, that's an interesting question. So I mean, I think that using experiments is sort of great sort of complement to running studies with kids or looking at child-directed speech and child corpora, because they really allow us to kind of set everything else aside except for the thing that we're specifically interested in. So for example, I've run some studies that look at how kids acquire gender, grammatical gender in a language. And this is a really interesting area because, like, number one, I think intuitively, a lot of us who've tried to learn a language that has grammatical gender as adults know that it's really tricky to do. And yet kids seem to master it. But there's also been really interesting work that suggests that kids pay more attention to certain types of cues rather than others. So like if you're familiar with a grammatical gender language like French or Spanish, you might know that there are semantic cues, so based on meanings of nouns. So for example, natural gender of an entity might give you a really good hint as to what grammatical gender it is. But there's also these low-level phonological cues, like what the ending of the noun looks like. That can also give you a clue. And there's work from natural language acquisition that suggests that kids pay more attention to the phonological cues than the semantic cues. But it's kind of mystery whether that's really the case or whether it's some property of the language itself. It's really hard to disentangle that sort of stuff. So we can use experiments, and I have used these kinds of experiments to sort of test in a more controlled setting. So when as the experimenter, I know that there's the presence of a phonological cue, there's the presence of semantic cue, they're both equally reliable. What do kids do? So in those circumstances, we can have a better, a more robust answer to these kinds of questions. But that's not about syntax per se. So that's about semantics and phonology.
Yeah.
So the work that I've done on syntax more suggests that as children are learning particular types of languages, they might struggle with some patterns more than others. So for example, I've done work on noun phrase word order. Suggesting, for example, that if you're learning a language in which there's sort of mixed head direction, so sometimes you have got the noun first, sometimes you got the modifier first, depends on what kind of modifier is in the phrase, like could be an adjective, could be a numeral, that in experimental settings, you see that kids, for example, have a really hard time picking up patterns which have, for example, a noun before an adjective, but after a numeral. And that's interesting because actually you don't necessarily see that in children's productions. So if you looked at a corpus of child speech, you wouldn't necessarily know that kids are having trouble with that. So it's kind of cool from an experimental perspective to see that in the very early stages of learning, this might be something that kids really struggle with, and eventually they're going to master it. But that's still something we want to know about. we want to understand about how the language acquisition process develops. That was a long-winded answer to your question, but
perfect. We appreciate long-winded answers. So one thing you've done is use constructed languages to and make computational models of those to sort of get at what's going on more. How do those help with this sort of thing, or if they do?
Yeah, so I mean, basically all the stuff I was just describing uses constructed languages, and that's just for the reason I said. So you kind of want to make sure that you have precise control over all the features of the language. You don't want other things sort of getting in the way of the question of interest. So constructed languages are a really great way to do that. You just can't do that with natural language. And you can also create patterns that we don't think exist in natural languages. So say we want to know if some pattern is just like impossible for people to learn. Well, we can't go and look and see whether kids who are learning such a language can't do it.
Yeah.
This doesn't make any sense. But you can use constructed languages to do that. So that's good. And then in terms of where models come in, I mean, they're used in a lot of different circumstances. So I use them, for example, when we have very complex patterns of results and we want to understand, like, if we have a particular hypothesis about why those results hold, we want to have a kind of formal way of checking, is our hypothesis really a good match for what the data we got in an experiment is? So models can be really good for doing that. You can really sort of concretely instantiate your hypotheses, make predictions from that model, and then see, do they match up well with the data that you have from your experiments?
So one thing that's quite striking about that is how theoretically distant it is, that it's models constructed on the basis of particular experiments rather than assuming a particular syntactic framework.
Yeah.
And how do you see the experimental work then fitting in with the linguistic theory, if you do at all?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think the reason I just gave for using a model isn't it's kind of more internal to the experiment when you want to make sure that what you think is going on is what's really going on. But it is possible to integrate the kind of hypotheses that I'm interested in, namely, do people find certain patterns easier to acquire than others? You can integrate those into theories of language, and I think one should. But you have to have a formalism in which the notion of a bias is actually present. And that's not the case for all syntactic formalisms, for example. So there isn't a really good way to sort of integrate a bias for something into a minimalist grammar.
Yeah.
So the work that I've done there is all within optimality theory, because there is a version of optimality theory where the notion of a bias is sort of baked in. So, to me, to a certain degree, I don't, it's not necessarily the case that I think OT is the right framework, but it is a, formal theory of language that allows you to instantiate the notion of something is harder to learn than another thing. And it's my hope that other theories of syntax will sort of follow, but that hasn't necessarily happened yet. So once it does, then we can think about, how to model the kind of experiments I do with those formalisms.
So when we had David Purple on, he was talking about how one of the problems he sees is that a lot of work in formal syntax goes on without really an eye to seeing how these things are computed in real time.
Yeah.
And do you see that as would you like to see that sort of confluence of more formal work and theoretical work, theoretical and experimental work working together more?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was trained as a cognitive scientist, so I've always sort of approached language from the perspective of, like, it is part of our cognitive system, and part of what we do when we learn a language is, it's probably might have to do with our specific language faculty, but there's the rest of our cognition is also at work and probably helping us in doing that. So, to the degree that syntax is affected by that, then I think, we want our syntactic theories to be able to reflect psychological processes and cognitive processes that are actually happening.
So talked about typological universals and how those might be related to more general cognitive capacities. Could you elaborate on that then a little more?
So this notion of syntactic harmony or consistent headedness, so this is a kind of classic typological universal. It's maybe one of the best known ones. And there have been sort of linguistic theories of why that might be more common in languages. So why we might see more languages with harmonic type patterns. So for example, in principles and parameters, there was this head direction parameter. But there's always like been this kind of intuition that maybe it's to do with something much more general, like a bias for simpler grammars or simpler hypotheses more generally. And so simplicity is a very good example of a sort of general cognitive pressure that very likely is shaping linguistic systems, including syntax. And in this domain, it's pretty easy to see. So if you have a grammar that has a single rule that says always put heads before dependents, well, that's much simpler than a grammar that has to specify for each head dependent combination what's the order going to be. So it's just a simpler grammar. So that's a very high level cognition general bias that has a very specific instantiation, and you need to have a notion of what a head is and what a dependent is, and those are kind of linguistic notions, but nevertheless they interact with this sort of higher level cognitive bias. So that's one example. But there's also been a lot of work on a kind of notion of naturalness. So naturalness in phonology is really well thought out, and it mainly has to do with things that are phonetically grounded. But you can think of a kind of notion of naturalness in syntax as well. So, for example, things that are kind of grounded in meaning are maybe more natural. And there's been a lot of work in the particular paradigms I use. So, artificial language learning experiments, silent gesture experiments. That look into whether there's some kind of notion of naturalness that shapes language. And these are maybe not cognition general things, but they're things like, well, put animates first. If you've got an animate in your sentence, say that thing first. And so that's been claimed, for example, to explain why so many languages are SVO and SOV. So it's not a notion of, it's not anything about the fact that it's a grammatical subject. You don't care that the grammatical subject is first. What you want is for animate things to come first, and those things tend to be subjects.
Yeah.
So that's also a kind of bias that one could imagine is perceptual in nature. So maybe animate things are very salient to us. We're animate beings. We care a lot about things that are animate. So that's another notion of like something that might be more general, not something that syntacticians necessarily think of as driving syntax.
Yeah. So do you think the sort of theorizing that takes place as subject is structurally highest, and that's why it comes first, and that sort of thing? Has it put the cart before the horse a bit, or is it just that these experiments can allow us to rethink what's really going on and fit it into a wider picture of cognition?
I think probably the second thing you said more reflects what I think. Yeah, I mean, it could be that having the subject in that particular place in the structure results from these other things. So it's not that isn't the case, it's just that the structures that we represent, the syntactic representations that we have, are driven in part by those less specific facts about what we find salient in the world.
So you've also talked about how language is shaped by use, and I suppose that's that fits into all this. It's an underlying thing. And communication, that's been criticized a lot by a lot of people in sort of mainstream generative grammars, but this is quite a different picture of language then.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think the idea that grammar is shaped by the fact that we use it for communication is Yeah, I'm not sure why that's such a radical and strange proposition,
Yeah.
frankly. It like, to be honest, it hasn't been my major motivation. I'm definitely much more interested in learning than I have been interested in usage. But I think there's tons of really interesting work now suggesting that communication is relevant for understanding why language looks the way it does at all levels. Um, so it's just a matter of how one fits that into. Again, it's the same as thinking about how learning biases fit into your theory of grammar. How does this notion of how it's used fit in?
So, what are some of the ways in which language is um, sort of designed for communicative efficiency, designed in scare quotes?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So like I said, it's not really my primary area, but I have done some work looking at how very kind of like very simple but critical features of language like regularity, structure, compositionality.
Mhm.
So those are kind of things we think of as kind of design features of language. But we've done some experiments to show that if you kind of divorce language from its use in communication, you don't necessarily get those kind of features evolving. So to do that, we use these iterated learning paradigms where we teach a sort of first generation an artificial language, then what they produce is passed on to a next generation in the lab, and so on. And so you can kind of simulate how things evolve from having no structure, no compositional structure, to having compositional structure, having
Okay.
no regularity, anything goes, to having regular rules of grammar.
Hmm.
And you can sort of show that if you take communication out of that process, things just sort of degenerate. So people tend to have sort of holistic grammars that don't have compositional structure, don't necessarily have regularity. On the other hand, if you take learning out, that also does some funny stuff to the grammars. So you have both of those pressures in. So if you only have communication, you don't have a pressure for learning, you get very complicated systems,
Mhm.
but they're very difficult for people to learn. So the experiments we've done sort of show that these two things go hand in hand um, in shaping what I think are pretty crucial properties of linguistic structure.
So, is a lot of this kind of work motivated by trying to understand where language came from?
Yeah, at least, yeah, some of it is. So the experiments I was just mentioning are actually we actually use manual gestures rather than spoken language, because those are the cases. It's actually sign languages where we have the best kind of window into how language emerges from nothing. So we don't really know how spoken languages emerged at first, right? That's too far away in the history of human evolution, but we can actually see that process happening for sign languages.
Mhm.
And so we were kind of interested in seeing whether the experimental stuff we do sort of mirrors what happens in actual emerging languages. Um, but yeah, it is really interested in that kind of work is really interested in understanding, how did human language come to have these critical design features we think sort of make language language.
So, to talk a little bit more about cognition in general, then, is is the language faculty under this kind of view something that came to be a little bit more sort of bit gradually, that parts of our general cognition became specialized towards one thing, or um,
Yeah, I mean that's my view. That's certainly my view. But I mean, it's not something we're likely to have an answer to ever.
yeah.
but but yeah, my view is that there's probably tons about our general cognition that is what allows us, once you put all those pieces together, is what allows us to have language like we have it. But it also has to do with the fact that we're a very social species.
Mhm.
So it's not divorced from the kind of animals that we are probably either.
So, where does this fit in with um, more classical theories in cognitive science, like the modularity of mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably to some degree orthogonal. So it could be that, our minds are massively modular, and yet, you know, they all are sort of functioning at a general level and not doing things that are specific to language. Or it could be the case that, actually, our brains are not modular in that way. So I think it's a kind of orthogonal issue.
And just to press that point about brains more, do you see this sort of more integrated work with the cognitive sciences also leading to more integration with neurosciences?
I mean, it's possible. I think cognitive science has always had a soft spot for the mind rather than the brain. So I think it's good to understand better how these things are actually instantiated in our neurons. But I'm more interested in the brain, in the mind part than the brain part. But I think, like you were mentioning you had David Popple on. I think the stuff that he does is really cool. To the extent that we can actually test theories about what representations are actually happening in our mind by looking at neural representations. Well, that's really great. That's a really critical part where understanding, integrating with evidence from neuroimaging is a good thing.
Yeah. So when it comes to picking between grammars and that sort of thing, it's are those as in theoretical grammars?
You
It's
mean like
hard.
different formalisms?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's hard to see how coming to the field new. It's hard to see how one can do that other than sort of just at times it can just look like a best guess. And do you think experimental syntax then has an eye to picking between those sort of formalisms?
I mean, I think that can often be really hard, because I don't think we fully understand to what degree these formalisms are actually equivalent to one another. I think many of them potentially are. And so it isn't, it's a matter of picking which one you like the best rather than picking which one is right, or, which one is true of how we represent grammar. But what I was saying before about, the ability to connect up with, notions of probabilistic biases or statistical learning, these kinds of processes, to the degree that some grammatical formalisms can do that and others can't, then some of them are going to fit better with experimental results. So that might help you choose between them, because it's going to be the case that some theories are not able to account for experimental results. And then the question is, can they, I don't know, like, are they actually able to sort of integrate with some external theories in psychology such that they still can maintain their kind of core of non-probabilistic, syntax and still be able to do that? But it doesn't seem to me that that's something that's really happening very much. So it's sort of a shame. So I think to date there's not really been that much in experimental syntax, at least not in my areas of experimental syntax, that are really getting at, telling you which of these theories is the right theory. There's some cases in which they can tell you in a particular framework, is one approach to phenomena X better than the other approach to phenomena X, but that's not the same as telling you, is construction grammar right or is minimalism right? That's quite different.
Yeah. What is the current direction in experimental syntax, insofar as we can talk about it generally then? What work do you see that's happening right now that you find the most interesting?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think so. just from my own perspective, so I guess there's like there's experimental syntax that's mainly like, doing grammaticality judgment tasks. And I don't really not, I'm not sure what's the most exciting stuff there. But in terms of my own area, so experimental syntax in the sense of, trying to use experiments to understand language typology.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of think the most interesting stuff is I hope going to go more towards what the previous question you just asked. So I think if experimental syntax really wants theoretical syntax to care, which we do, I think we need to do a better job of trying to trying to trying to make sure that the phenomena we're actually interested in are more perceived as more core to syntax.
Mm.
So for example, the stuff that I've been doing so far is about word order. Not, I think to a certain degree that's not really core syntax stuff. So like there's some work I'm doing on negation.
Mm.
Now negation is like a huge topic in syntax and semantics. It's something that a lot of people have really specific theories about. So I think, to the degree that we can really get in there and kind of test those theories using experimental paradigms like artificial language learning, I think that will be the most exciting thing. That being said, I think there's also some really cool stuff using experimental syntax in combination with natural language processing. You're probably aware that natural language processing is really in a boom right now. It's the past 10, 20 years have been really fantastic for building computational models of language. But actually, quite recently, there's been a really interesting interaction between using kind of psycholinguistic methods or experimental syntax methods to try to better understand like what neural network models are doing, what they're learning. Are they learning the kinds of representations that linguists think humans actually represent? Are they doing something that's really quite boring and lame, like using stupid little heuristics to learn what we think is actually very complicated? So that's kind of unrelated to doing artificial language learning, but I think it is a really important direction for experimental work on syntax, to sort of join in with the world of AI and NLP and sort of influencing the directions that field is going to go in.
Are these things like GPT-3 and?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So are they doing the kind of things kids are doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think it depends. There's differences between the different types of architectures of neural networks in terms of do they make the kind of, like, do they assume, or do we have the impression that what they're learning is something like hierarchical structure or not? So I don't think it's at all clear. I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but I think there's interesting room for linguists or syntacticians who are interested in that kind of thing to interact with people in that field to try to better understand like what exactly the representations the neural networks are.
So what are kids doing with things like linear order then?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good
question. It's a big question.
That's a big question, right? I mean, if I had to guess, since you're asking me, I think children represent hierarchical structure and linear order. And I think, I don't think there's any reason to choose between the two, but I certainly think that kids are building hierarchical representations.
Mm-hmm.
I think they do it very early. And so it's interesting to think about the degree to which these NLP systems actually do that. How does that reflect how well they perform on various tasks? But yeah, I think in terms of child language acquisition, kids are building those kinds of structure early on, but that doesn't mean that they're not sensitive to linear order.
Mm-hmm. So is that to be accounted for as the result of a general process, is something like simplicity motivating hierarchical structure as opposed to linear order rules?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's an interesting question. I also don't think we know the answer to. I think that's potentially another place where modeling can come in handy, because it's hard to know whether the input that children get is more simply explained by positing hierarchical structure or not. That's an empirical question. So mm-hmm. It's something we should probably work harder to understand.
All right, I think that's about all the questions we had in particular. It's been really interesting to talk to you, and
Thanks.
been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through
Yeah, no kidding.
experimental syntax bits. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.